Welcome to the RE Podcast, the first dedicated RE podcast for students and teachers.
My name is Louisa Jane Smith, and this is the RE Podcast, the podcast for those of you who think RE is boring, which it is, and I'll prove it to you. I am delighted to welcome back to the RE Podcast two of our favourite guests, Molly Acharya and Ash Kundi. Welcome, both of you.
Thanks a lot for having us.
Hello. How are you doing?
Are you well? Are you happy? Are you overworked, underpaid?
All of the above.
Yeah.
All of the above.
Oh, my goodness. So we are here because next Thursday, so this is going to come out about 6 days before Diwali.
Yes.
So I thought, what a great opportunity to chat to you about Diwali. So what is it? Ash, let's start with you.
So, common misconception actually of Diwali is that it's just one day. It's actually a collection of about 5 days is Diwali. And so day one is something called Dhanteras. Day two is Choti Diwali, which is where the idea is that Krishna defeated a demon called Narakasur, which got rid of fear in the area. And then there's a couple of pujas that come. So day three is a Lakshmi Puja, and day four is a Govardhan Puja, which is a very important mountain in India even today. And day five is Bhai Dooj, which is where brothers go and visit their sisters on the fifth day. And for me, and I mean obviously different things to different people, but for me, Diwali symbolises the victory of knowledge over ignorance and light over dark, good over evil. So for me, that's really what it is in a nutshell, about how to put knowledge in its best front forward to eradicate any level of ignorance in your life that you're experiencing.
Amazing. Molly, anything you want to add to that?
I agree with all that Ash has said. I would also say for those of us who live in the UK, Diwali is a brilliant time for families to get together as well. And that was especially difficult last year when you had lockdowns going on and people were isolating. So I isolated last year during Diwali, so I didn't get to celebrate it in the same way that I would have done normally. And even with our adapted style celebration, I couldn't do that. So I was doing a Zoom call with my mum, who lives like down the road from me, kind of thing. So it's brilliant in this country for communities to get together. And it's a mixture of all different communities. In our local area, we have Sikhs celebrate Diwali, as well as Hindus celebrate Diwali. The reasons might be different, but we all get together and celebrate together because it's a chance to have big celebrations and big parties and things as well.
I want to come back to sort of how you celebrate it and sort of how it's celebrated in a variety of ways depending on your culture and background and things like that. But I want to sort of unpack the story first. So what's the story behind Diwali?
So the main story that most people associate with Diwali is the story of Lord Ram and Sita as well. Rama had a stepmother who did not want Rama to be the king after her husband had passed away. So she kind of tricked her husband into sending Ram into exile. Her son, who she wanted to be king instead, Lakshman, was actually very loyal to Ram. They were very good brothers. And so he went with Rama and placed Rama's shoes on the throne, ready for when he could come back from his 14-year exile. Rama, Sita and Lakshman spend 14 years in the forests in exile, but they go through a lot of adversity together and a lot of good times together as well. Sita eventually gets captured. I'm putting this into a nutshell. It's a much longer story than this. It takes days to read the actual story. So I'm summarising it in a nutshell. Sita ends up being kidnapped by Lord Ravana, who's the 10-headed demon kind of monster. That's how he's portrayed. In actuality, he's probably a very lonely person who just wanted company. So he ends up kidnapping her because he wants her to be his wife, and captures her and takes her to the island of Lanka, which is now known as Sri Lanka. Hanuman manages to track her down. Hanuman is Lord Hanuman, who many people recognise as having the face of a monkey, but that's not actually how he should be referred to. He is Lord Hanuman, and many Hindus would see him as a different form of Lord Shiva because he embodies those kind of qualities that Shiva embodies of being resilient, being strong-minded, being able to adapt yourself to different scenarios and having that strength of character to be able to fight no matter what comes in your way, like the fight of mind rather than physical fight. So he manages to track Sita down, and there is a big battle, and Sita is rescued. And eventually, after 14 years, they return to the city of Ayodhya, where, because it's dark when Rama and Sita and Lakshmana are coming back with Hanuman, they light up the way with candles. And that's why we have the candles being lit at Diwali time as well. And then Rama gets his coronation, sits on the throne there at that time. So that's the key story for there. But for the other stories with the other days, you have different stories linked to that as well. And Narkasur as well, because that's another important story. And for a lot of Hindus, that would be the main one for them.
Well, in terms of the Ramayana story, that it was Bharat that Lakshmana went to the forest, yeah.
And Bharat put the shoes on. Yes, you're right.
Yeah, it was Bharat. I think something else to add though as well, because obviously Molly spoke earlier about different traditions, obviously prioritising Diwali as well. So, for example, the Sikh community also prioritises Diwali, and some Sikhs will also call it something called Bandi Chor Divas. Essentially, the story behind for the Sikh community is the idea that Guru Har Gobind, who was held in a fort, was released upon this day as well, who was considered one of the most important gurus, obviously, for Sikhs. So it genuinely is a festival that unites a lot of different communities for many different reasons. They all have their own specific reasons as to why they find it particularly important, which I think in terms of India as a country, it kind of demonstrates the pluralist ethos that goes with the festival.
Mm. And actually what seems to come out is what you were saying earlier, Ash, about this is a festival that remembers good over evil and challenging and bringing light in the darkness. And that sort of links with the story of Rama and Sita. Are there any other themes that come out of the stories that are remembered at Diwali?
Good over evil is a key theme. Good can be many things, because what is good and how we see good will be different to different people. But the idea that we vanquish demons, and it can be our inner demons as well. It's a good time for people to make New Year's resolutions, resolve to be a better person, be more kind of linked in with their duty or their dharam. They don't all have to be religious followers within the Hindu tradition to be able to follow their dharam better, their duty better. They could be a better person in terms of helping in their local community, or in terms of doing their job better, or in terms of being a family member better, being better in communication with their family, or having that loyalty to family, or helping people out. It can mean, dharam or duty can mean different things to different people, but it's about making yourself as a person a better person, that good overcoming evil. It might be that you've done someone something wrong in the past, so you can make it better for that person or other people. So for different people, there will be a diversity of how people interpret that. But it's up to the individual to decide and find that way themselves.
Yeah.
I think in terms of themes and things like that, often people look at it and go, right, Festival of Light, and look at these lovely lights that are being put up, and it does look lovely. But it's also what if I was to take the Jyot, or some people refer to it as a Diva lamp, as well as to what that actually represents. Yes, it represents knowledge overcoming ignorance, but it's about the practicality of how it does that as well. So, for example, the light of the fire actually burning away at the wick of ignorance is a really important symbol. So just, I suppose, keep your focus on the actual ethos and the purpose of the festival. And whilst there is a lot of celebration and as Molly mentioned earlier, bringing families together, there's a lot of happiness around the time as well. It also represents new beginnings, because there's a new year that is within the Diwali Day 4. Which is one of the new years, and it's about new beginnings and getting rid of anything, I suppose, negative in your life, and then replacing that with positivity moving forward.
I mean, it's interesting. It seems such a positive time, isn't it? That actually you're thinking about your own ignorance, you're thinking about yourself and being critical of yourself, trying to be a better person, connecting with your family. You know, I just think these are just wonderful, wonderful things to have the opportunity to bring to the forefront of your day for those 5 days. We want to talk a little bit about how it's celebrated, a bit more detail, but is there any other sort of stories behind Diwali that we feel that are important to talk about?
Yeah, so another key story is the story of Lord Krishna. So, as you know, both Lord Krishna and Lord Rama are both avatars of Vishnu. And Vishnu's main role is to keep on preserving the world and sustaining the world. So both of these avatars in their different ways do that by kind of getting rid of demons, getting rid of evil and sin that's entered the world. In particular, for this festival, Krishna's linked to the slaying of Lord Nrkasur, and I'll spell that for you later, Lou. So Nrkasur, or Naraka is his kind of abbreviated name, is a king. And he becomes a power-crazed king and kind of wants to do whatever a good ruler wants to do, but for his own purposes. So he's power-hungry, he is intoxicated with that power. So he starts off with the name Naraka, but because he gets these kind of power-crazed, demonic way of behaving, his name becomes Nrkasur later on. So kind of like how most people get a different name because they've become an enlightened being, this is kind of the reverse to show that he's gone the other way. He destroys all the kingdoms around him and plans to assault the heavens. And Krishna then arrives and uses his divine power to neutralize Nrkasur and his weapons. And that leads to him eventually being beheaded with a multi-pronged discus. Now, if you know anything about the imagery of Vishnu, Vishnu is depicted with a discus. So it's that same discus that Vishnu's passed on to his avatar of Krishna there. And so it's because of him being able to behead this demon that we have this story again of good overcoming evil and clearing the world of this sin that's entered there.
There's such big themes, aren't they, that are covered in, other religions as well. It's just such sort of a universal idea, isn't it, of atonement and dealing with sin and dealing with evil.
Yes, exactly. It's more symbolic.
Yeah.
While those stories for many believers will be true, the actual symbolism that they're showing that we can get rid of that inner demon, and that we can become better people, and we can, if we choose the kind of way of light, the way of knowledge, we will be empowered to be able to do that. And that's the key thing that people have to remember. And that allows them to make those new beginnings.
Yeah, amazing. Yeah. Ash?
Also, in terms of the story, there's a key word actually to apply to it as well, because I'm just bouncing off what Molly was talking about people believing in terms of historical truths and symbolic truths as well. And within Sanatan, if you want to call it scripture, I suppose, this would be put under the category of itihas. And itihas roughly translates to historical texts. So the thing is that the word itihas can also mean historical, but it can also mean that which will always be true. With Sanskrit as a whole as well, it's such a multidimensional language with numerous meanings, which I'll never be an expert in, to be perfectly honest. But the symbolic nature of the stories that are told is so important, and obviously we'll get onto the teaching of it later on as to how we teach it in schools. In terms of the actual focus on symbolism, rather than treating it superficially, is absolutely crucial, really. But yeah, that word itihas is probably a useful word to be using in schools, as to identify, well, what is history exactly, and how do we know whether something is historically true or false or accurate or inaccurate, and those sorts of discussions. So for many Sanatanis, they would consider this in some cases to be a literal truth as well. For others, it would be more of a symbolic idea of that the values within this will always be true.
Yeah. And it's interesting, isn't it? Because the human condition is universal and the human nature is universal. And so anything which exposes that, maybe asking whether it's historically true is the wrong question. And actually what's important is its significance and meaning for people today.
Exactly, yeah.
I want to sort of think about how it is celebrated. And obviously the message that seems to be coming through is there isn't a way of celebrating Diwali. But is there any sort of common ways of celebrating that sort of seems to be within all cultures and traditions?
Offerings to the deities. So you always create a shrine which will have Lord Ganesh and Lakshmi in the middle. The other deities will be there. They'll be washed. Then they'll be decorated with flowers, etc. and lights put up around the shrine as well. And then in our family, each of us will go to the shrine and will do their own sort of decorating of each deity or image of the divine. And then together we will stand and offer arti, which is the special prayers, before we then have a feast. But part of the kind of decorating of each deity involves putting on the tilak mark on the forehead, placing rice on the forehead of each image, offering some flowers, And we offer also nuts and fruit, and then we also offer some Indian kind of sweets, or burfi, as some people might know them.
And is there significance in that food? Is it that particular type of food for a reason?
Yeah, it's all linked to things which are natural because God or the divine has gifted us those fruits. So you want to offer natural things. There's never any meat offered in a shrine ever to the divine. Never any food. In my family's tradition, we never offer anything with onion or garlic in either, because they kind of are seen to be impure. So we offer pure vegetarian food only, because the divine is pure and they only accept pure kind of things. Well, why would you give them anything that classed as impure?
Yeah.
And then that prasad, once it's been offered and they bless it, then that becomes prasad, and then that's redistributed for all the different people who are there. Sometimes people will take prasad to the mandir, to the main temple near them, and they will offer that. Sometimes people will take their offerings and redistribute it amongst the local community as well. It depends on the family. If a family doesn't have a lot of money, the Krishna says, it doesn't matter what kind of offering you give me. If you give it me with the sincerity of heart, that's the more important thing. And that's true at Diwali time as well. Some people will have massive, lavish shrines set up, and some people might only have a simple shrine. That doesn't really matter. It's the kind of action that's done at the time that's the more important bit. And once everyone's had their chance to make their offering, then that group prayer is done. There's a special prayer at Diwali time, or arti at Diwali time. And then once that's done, we have a feast and we have fireworks as well. That's a key thing. Children can't celebrate Diwali without the fireworks, and that's essential. In India, Lord Rama would have been welcomed back with fireworks as well. But now we see in India, because of the kind of high levels of pollution, fireworks aren't allowed in a lot of the cities, so they do alternative methods instead.
Okay, thank you so much. Ash, anything to add?
Yeah, just a couple of things actually. We do largely the same thing, and like I've been in India when they're doing fireworks. I remember once in India when I was doing fireworks, there was a lad that put, the Catherine wheel, like the ones that just go round and round and round. Well, he put a Catherine wheel on the ground and he was there dancing around it. They just absolutely had no fear as well.
Oh my gosh.
Just a lad because I used to go to India all the time as a kid growing up, and it was just, honestly, it's such a different experience. Whenever we can get, past this time of COVID regulations and stuff like that, I'd highly recommend anyone going to India and experiencing Diwali, because it's just a different league. But one thing that I'll say about Diwali in the UK, because obviously Molly mentioned it earlier in the podcast, that I know that's obviously grown in the UK a lot, and I think it actually outlines probably one of the biggest success stories of the Indian diaspora as it's gone across the world, really, because there's a story that, the director of Bend It Like Beckham, Gurinder Chadda, she talks about how when her family first came over from India, that all they had was a solitary candle to celebrate Diwali, and they just put that outside of their home. And they'd be the only sort of Indian family doing anything for Diwali. And then obviously if you walk down Leicester, place like, I think it's Melton Road in Leicester now, where you go down there, well, it's more than just a single candle, and it just outlines a real big success story now of South Asian communities, I suppose. But in terms of like the dietary things and stuff like that, just a couple of things that I thought was actually worth mentioning as well. So in terms of onions and garlic as well, the things with onions and garlic is that if you've heard of Ayurveda, which is basically medicinal practices within the Veds, is that onions and garlic are considered to be things that you can eat, but obviously particularly within a balance. So they can be things that can trigger off certain perhaps emotions and things like that within you. It's not just categories of food, that I'm going to share. These are categories of just being and living, really. But there's sattvic, rajasic and tamasic. So sattvic is considered very, very pure ways of conduct. Rajasic are things that are very, I suppose, royally kind of indulgent, and tamasic are things that just don't really have you can have them, but they don't have a really great impact on your well-being as a person. So I'll say those three categories, and this is, I suppose, part of the decolonisation aspect, that people will look at those three categories and go, well, that's sinful tamasic and that's pure, and they'll make it like that, but actually that's not what it's meant to be. It's meant to be, well, actually, what is good for my well-being and what isn't good for my well-being, and balancing out in that way. One other thing that I'd add in terms of food is a lot of people choose to deep fry things during Diwali as well. And the popping of a deep fryer is meant to represent arguments within the house, that you're just getting those out of the way before you start the new year coming up, that we're starting on good terms and things like that. I always like that idea of that this is just meant to represent all our arguments and we'll get them out of the way. And I suppose the food that you get out of it is the positive thing, try to put a positive spin onto things as you move through. But yeah, it's meant to be that crackling of the deep fryer is meant to represent, right, we're getting them all out of the way, so when we start fresh, we're not going to have as many. Yeah, in terms of food and fireworks and things like that, very, very consistent with what Molly's mentioned, definitely.
Mm. And where do you think you see the biggest difference in how Diwali is celebrated? So is it, say, between the UK and India? Is it between, say, Hindu Dharma and Sikhi? Where are the sort of variations? What sort of things are done in one group that wouldn't be done in another group?
Well, Sikhi have different origin stories, like Ash mentioned before,
yeah.
But the manner in which it's celebrated in terms of parties and big food will be similar, but obviously Sikhs won't do the worship of the deities in their homes or go to the mandir to do that. They'll go to the Gurdwara instead, and they'll do their prayers at the Gurdwara, but they won't make offerings in the same way. So the origin stories is the kind of key fundamental to that, and that kind of links in with difference of celebrations in the home. But generally, we go to big parties together. And at those big parties, it won't be just Sikhs or Hindus there either. A lot of people from other faith traditions will come because they want to experience it. They want to get dressed up and get blinged out and stuff and have the meals, have the fancy meals that we're having with each other and enjoy that time together as a community. I went yesterday to Navratri celebrations and I took one of my friends with me who's not Hindu. And she was like, oh, this would be so good if our local community did this. She belongs to a different faith tradition and her community don't do anything like that. And for those of you who don't know, Navratri is kind of celebrating Goddess Durga. It's also celebrating harvest time. And there's a lot of folk dancing. So there's a lot of stick dancing and a lot of twirling round in big circles as a large member of the community. So you're all together having fun together. And to be able to do that again as a member of the community is brilliant fun. And, whether you go to celebrate it for religious reasons or just go to celebrate it because you're dancing together, it's all about being part of that community. And I think for most of us within the Sikh, Hindu, Jain community, when you go to these large functions, that's the key thing, is that we're all together celebrating and enjoying ourselves there.
Amazing. Yeah. I want to sort of bring it down to sort of a practical level for those RE teachers that are listening in terms of how we effectively and authentically teach this in the classroom. What sort of things have we got to try and avoid doing? What sort of things would be really good to do in the classroom if we're teaching this?
In terms of the actual teaching, I think it goes back to things that myself and Molly have mentioned before in previous podcasts when we talk about Sanat and heard about that. It's the deeper philosophical messages behind a lot of the stories and the symbolism behind a lot of the imagery that you might come across as well. So Molly spoke earlier about Hanuman having a monkey head, if you want to call it. Having a monkey head and being depicted in that way. Now, the thing is that growing up, I suppose this is me getting a bit personal about myself in terms of my own spiritual nature, but I would consider myself Hanuman Bhakt, so I really look up to Hanuman in terms of the values of Hanuman and living out those ideals as best I can in my life. But the thing is that people often just refer to him as the monkey god, as some kind of comedic, kind of mischievous monkey within the Ramayana, which really does not do any good service to the role of Hanumanji in the story. But actually, when you look deeper into the depiction of, for example, Hanumanji in the Ramayana, having been personified with a monkey face, is that it demonstrates this idea of having completely mastered the idea of yoga and balance in your life. In India, there's a common saying that your brain is like a monkey. Basically, it's always jumping around from one thought to the other all the time. And the idea that is that Hanuman has completely mastered the mind, that he is a completely balanced individual who has completely mastered yoga. And the way that he's completely mastered yoga is through ultimate devotion towards the divine with Ram as well. And even with Ravan as well, with 10 heads, what I'd like to try and avoid is this idea of it is colourful storytelling, but at the same time, we can't just leave it at colourful storytelling as well. Because if you just leave it at colourful storytelling, what you risk is people turning around to Hindu kids and going, well, hang on, why do you believe in that? In particularly the primary school, which 9 or 10-year-old kid is going to be able to talk about the deeper philosophical truths of the Ramayana if they've not even been necessarily exposed to it? I mean, I was struggling to talk about the story of Narakasur earlier. I'm 30. So the thing is that it's important that we talk about those deeper spiritual meanings. So, for example, with Ravan, those 10 heads and 20 arms are meant to represent a couple of things, really. He was a great scholar, was Ravan, an incredible scholar. And he was actually even a pundit, so the equivalent of, if you want to call it a priest, I suppose, if you were to recolonize it, I suppose. Yeah, so he's considered a pundit who had an incredible amount of knowledge of the Vedas and things like that. So, but obviously he misused that knowledge as well. So the idea is that you can have all the intellect in the world, but if you're misusing it with your ego, it'll lead to your downfall. The 10 heads also represent 10 specific bad qualities that you need to be looking to not necessarily avoid, but at least balance as well. So, for example, anger. So anger, you have to have anger in life sometimes because you have righteous anger, which is used in the right direction, but he was misusing anger and it took over him. So when you look at it much deeper, there's a lot of lessons for life that young people certainly can learn from within it as well. But yeah, I think it's something that with the teaching of Diwali, that as soon as we look at those deeper philosophical ideas and not teach it as pure storytelling, it's a great story and it's a great story for kids to learn and it's really engaging as well. But I'd say we're only, in terms of how to put a percentage on it, I think we're only covering, I'd say about 5% of what we could if we're just focusing on just the story. The deeper symbolic meaning will have a lot of impact as well. I'm sure there's schools out there that'll do that, but I think it has so much more impact when it's taught in that way.
Amazing. Yeah, I think that's great. Molly, anything you want to add about what to do and what not to do in the classroom?
I agree completely with what Asha said, and I think an easy task that teachers could set students to complete in the classroom is to give them an image of Lord Rama with Sita, Hanuman and Lakshman there, and also an image of Ravana, and they could actually kind of label the image with the qualities and the symbolism we find in the story. So they've read the story, they might have done a guided reading task on the story, and now they can apply that to the symbolism that they find. They can use that image to give them a visual stimulus to help hook their memory onto that, and they can add that symbolism as a kind of guided image analysis, I suppose. And that would be a really practical visual way for some of our learners to kind of unpack that deeper meaning of the story, more than just read it, do some comprehension questions and then summarise it in your own words. You know, knowing the story is one thing, but understanding, as Asha said, the deeper meaning of it is the more important bit. And I think that use of imagery would help our learners a lot with that.
Yeah. Do you know what is interesting? What is striking me is how much science is now catching up with sort of eternal spiritual truths. You know, just even thinking about the symbolism of Hanuman and having a face of a monkey, that if you think about Professor Steve Peters, who wrote the chimp paradox, this is the latest kind of understanding of the human brain, that we have a chimp brain that sometimes sabotages our lives. And actually we have to kind of control that chimp nature in order to be successful, whole, mentally well human beings. And even just now, the research that's being done between gut health and mental health, that you hold a lot of your stress within your gut. So if you look after your gut, it's going to improve your mental health. And that we know that foods like garlic and onion can aggravate your gut. And we can link that to sort of physical illnesses like IBS, and we can link that to stress, tension, anxiety. So it's really interesting that we're beginning to see science and religion come together again. And that these are not old-fashioned ideas with funny characters. These are eternal truths that have been discovered thousands of years ago by ancient religious teachers that are now, it's like science is catching up again.
Yes.
It's fascinating, isn't it?
Exactly that.
The thing is that, and I think you've hit a really important point there actually, Lou, because the thing is that if you look at Sanatana Dharma purely in this lens, we talk about lenses a lot in RE, but if we look at it in this lens of faith and religion and things like that, it's not necessarily the right lens to be looking at it. So, if we look at the early stages of Sanatana Dharma, the rishis and the rishikas rishikas is the female term for people that were doing the same job as the rishis, that were thinking up the Vedas, and so, for example, the Vedas is one example. It effectively is a science, really, because the thing is that scripture within Sanatana Dharma does work somewhat differently to other traditions, in the sense that, for example, members within Sanatana Dharma will be quite happy to completely reject scriptures from previous times. So, for example, some smritis, so there's one that I can think of called Manusmriti, which talks about hierarchies and things like that, which people often quote to say, to justify caste system and things like that, to say, oh, well, actually, your scripture says this, so therefore you must believe that. But actually, the Smritis are purely historical context, and they come with a sell-by date, basically, as well. So, like, they're things that can actually be rejected, and we can move on from that. But even in terms of what you're talking about with, the science of use of onions and garlic, Ayurveda, it was the science of the time, which is obviously coming through to now. And that's why, by not having a particular founder, by focusing on pluralism, that there are many different ways to a good well-being, science is effectively having a number of different perspectives and finding what works and what is valid, effectively. And that's essentially how Sanatana Dharma works. The spirituality that we're experiencing right now may be well for this time, but do not get attached to it, because effectively this might not be relevant 30, 40, 50, 100 years down the line. And and Krishna talks talks about the same thing in the Bhagavad Gita, that, do not get attached to the ritual.
Yeah.
It's the spirituality that you need to be, not getting attached to, but that you need to be focusing on as well, because rituals, they come and go. But your spirituality and your well-being don't. They stay. You can only do that if you're willing to evolve through time as well. So I think you've hit on a really important point there, definitely.
It's so wonderful that we started this episode talking about Diwali and have ended up talking about truths, universal truths.
Yeah.
And I think that's what's wonderful about chatting to you guys and your wisdom and knowledge. So thank you so much. I want to sort of end just to give you the opportunity, if there's anything else you want to say about Diwali or anything else that we've talked about today, just before we leave, what message would you like to leave our listeners with?
One thing I would say is that the story of Rama and Sita does not end with them just coming back to Ayodhya and celebrating Lord Rama being crowned as the king. There is another ending to it. It just carries on after that for more pages in the original scripture. So if you are looking at telling the full story of Lord Rama and Sita, because you see there's a kind of different character to Rama with Sita, so good for people to investigate that story more if they were looking at Hindu Dharma in more detail rather than just stopping at that point, would be my key thing to remember about Lord Rama. But yeah, enjoy the celebration.
Amazing. Ash, what about you? Any final thoughts?
Yeah, I just think in terms of what it means to Sanatanis, and also in terms of if we're going to talk about the Ramayana story as a whole, Ram was effectively, if you look at his life, he just had one mishap after another happen to him all the way through. And so did Sita. It was just one mishap after another. And the thing is that what that's meant to represent is the art of living, the art of Dharma. And the thing is about, you have multiple types of Dharma within your life. So Ram was a king, he was a family person. He had so many different roles within life. And the thing is that it's about how do we balance those roles within life, and how do we make sense of the chaos that is going on in our lives as well all the time. And it's about being able to put those values that we learn from the Ramayana, like selflessness, like integrity, like devotion, faith, those sorts of values and principles, and not remembering it just on the day, but actually living those values day in, day out. And that ultimately leads to somewhat of making life a lot more simpler than we sometimes make it a lot more complicated than it should be. So I just think that was an important point to get across, that the idea of gives a lot of Sanatanis the reminder to the art of living, which a lot of these epics or itihas do. For example, the Mahabharata is the same. It just teaches, Sanatanis the art of living, and that it's not just a one-off day that you're thinking, right, I'll remind myself of this and I'll enjoy it and that sort of thing. But actually, how is this going to empower me for the rest of my life? So the best way to do that is by getting together, reflecting on it and enjoying the day, because when you enjoy it, you're conditioned to live it.
Yeah.
Just keep enjoying it.
Yeah. Absolutely. It's just so, actually what's really lovely is this year, the day of Diwali falls on the 4th of November, which is the day before the 5th of November, which is where a lot of people in the UK are going to be setting off fireworks and seeing beautiful lights. And so actually it'd be really, really lovely if people kind of connect with the themes of Diwali as they're setting off their fireworks this year, and connect with those ideas of gut health and mental health and overcoming evil and being the best you can be and being resilient and fighting evil within yourself and within the world. And I think that's a really, really lovely way to end this podcast. So Molly and Ash, thank you so much for coming back again.
An absolute pleasure as always.
Good.
No problem. It's been a pleasure as usual.
Good. My name is Louisa Jane Smith, and this has been the RE Podcast, the podcast for those of you who think RE is boring, which it is. We just proved it to you. But thank you so much for listening to us for the life out of you.